Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome to Word First Radio, the podcast brought to you by Word First Ministries. I am your host, Jacob O'Neill, and as always, I'm joined by my friend Cameron.
Hey.
And today, once again, we are joined by our friend Leif Egil, who's here to continue the discussion we had last week. You still doing good, Leif?
I'm great, yeah.
Yeah, you look. You haven't changed a bit since last time.
It's been ones of seconds.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's you.
So cool. Well, anyways, Leif, thank you so much for all of your insights on the last episode. I think that was really helpful, really for me and Cameron specifically, trying to understand the current environment politically and socially around abortion in Norway. And so today we wanted to kind of just dig in to the pro-life position and some of the rationale behind that, especially as Christians. So I'm just going to throw it out there, Leif. What, and you could start, there's probably several reasons why you're pro-life. I know there's several reasons why I'm pro-life, but if you just had to start with one of them, why are you pro-life?
So I would begin with the reason I entertained the very most when I was in middle school, because then I came from an atheistic perspective. And I realized that the main question we need to discuss is this a human life? And I remember when we discussed this for several weeks in the free time, and I really thought this was a very hard question to answer. And I ended up on the perspective that, well, I really don't know. But if I don't know if it's a human life, we probably should not eliminate it. Because if it is, that's a major problem. And if it is not, and then I kind of backed off and said, like, well, it's still a women's health issue. I don't have any say in it, and I left it at that. But I've since revised my position.
Sure.
Well, there's a I say famous depending on the circles that you walk in, thought experiment that I think concludes with that very conservative conclusion. And the conclusion is something like, how certain do you have to be that what you're doing is not killing a human life before you engage in the thing? So the thought experiment is something like, you're in charge of demolishing a building, and just before you push the button that demolishes the building, you see a little girl's bicycle in front of the building. And we imagine that there are some, we call them bean counters. There's somebody who can give you an accurate estimate. Okay, there's a 60% chance that there's a little girl in that building. If there's a 60% chance that when you demolish the building, you're going to kill a human life, then would you still push the button? And then, of course, you just keep pressing that same intuition. So, okay, what if the bean counters come back and they say it's 20%? 20% chance there's a little girl in there. But about 10%, what about 2%? And most people, it's interesting, most people's intuition, I think, was like yours. And I think a lot of people make the same move. So the intuition is, if pushing this button kills a little girl, I have to be really sure that there isn't one in there. And of course, you can see how that's analogous to abortion. But then I think people do the same thing. But it's women's rights. I should stay out of this. I'm not allowed to have an opinion, or my opinion is not valuable, or whatever. So my voice doesn't count. Something like that. But it's interesting. That's interesting that as a middle schooler you would take that conservative approach. Like, I don't know if what we're killing is a human or not, therefore we probably shouldn't do it.
Right. I think, well, just hearing you say that, I'm trying not to feel this way just because it concludes with opinion I agree with. But I think that that's super rational. I think that that's super, I mean, I think that it seems like common sense to me. It seems like really basic reasoning that has just has a good conclusion to draw from it. That's like, listen, if somebody came and told me I'm 90% sure that a little girl's not in this building, I could not let him push the button. Like, I don't need you to be 90% sure. I don't need you to be 95% sure. I need you to be 100% sure that there is no little girl in this building before I could let you push the button. There's no way that I could do that otherwise. And just real quick, because it's come up twice now, you guys can say whatever you want to about this, but I'll just say really quickly, I know that, say this this podcast episode caught wind on somewhere online, and they see, listen, you guys are 3 white men coming on here talking about abortion and a women's issue. You guys are not qualified to talk about this. So, first of all, removing me from the equation, I'll defend Cameron and Leif's qualifications to talk about this to anyone. But this is, I'll just say real quick, it's not just a women's issue. It might affect women more than men, but I can say, as somebody who's been in recovery ministry and have met lots of men who have gone through this issue. They've either had abortions or considered abortions. And I know that men carry the burden of this issue very strongly. You might say that women carry it stronger than men do. I'd be willing to say that. But men also carry this burden very, very powerfully and very strongly. And it's a really tough thing for them to go through. And I've had to see that. And for Leif and Cameron as fathers, and as for men who are potential fathers, what fathers say about this issue is important. And it's unfair to dismiss them because of their opinions on that. So that's just all the statement I want to say about that. I don't want to harp on that issue too long. I want to get back to the arguments and the substance of them. So, Leif, I think that argument that you just made is very strong. Maybe, I don't know if there's anything else you guys wanted to say about that, but I'd actually want to move on to the question that settles the issue, or that the most important question of all. Leif, where you stand now in your opinion and belief is, I'll just ask you, is what is in the woman's womb a life? Is it a living human or a living thing?
Actually, is it okay, Jay? I'm sorry. I'm half sorry to interrupt. Is it okay if I ask that same question slightly differently?
Sure.
So
Go for it.
We've gone through the thought experiment, and it says we found a little girl's tricycle, and we've thought about how certain do we have to be that there's not a little girl in there before we push the button that destroys the building. Somebody could say, yeah, but the thought experiment is disanalogous because we don't have a tricycle. We know what's in the womb, and it's not a human baby. It's whatever else the definition is. Usually something like a zygote or an embryo. But we know that whatever that thing is, it's not a human being, or it's not a human person, or it's something that doesn't have a moral status such that it would be immoral to kill it. So prove that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say that first off, if it is a human living being, there's 3 specific things. It needs to be human, it needs to be living, and it needs to be a being. So in the broadest sense, being is absolutely obvious. It cannot not be a being. If it was not a being, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Yeah.
And then, is it living? Well, there are cells here. And if we found anything remotely like the smallest embryo on Mars, we would say we have found life on Mars. So, to me, living is also not very controversial.
Yeah.
And then human. And to me, at least today, that seems almost as obvious that it needs to be human, because what else could a human produce? Like, humans doesn't produce foxes. Like,
right, exactly.
But one could say, well, humans produce saliva.
Mm-hmm.
So one could say it's some sort of byproduct that is not a human. But
Or
we
not a
do
human
know
yet.
that. Yes, exactly. So, but we do know that this living being is the same living being that will be a human in some time, at the very least. And then the question is really, what do we mean with the term human? Because if the human is defined by its DNA, we know it's obviously human because it has its DNA from the beginning forward. If it's defined by its brain chemistry, well, then it needs to have that kind of brain chemistry. So the question is, what do we define human as?
Right.
And most, at the very least, if we go to the scientific literature, this is very easy. If you go to any embryology paper, basically any, so to be careful, to basically any, you will find they will say it's a human living being.
Yeah.
But then the question is that enough?
Right.
So you brought up, Cameron, that does it have a moral status?
Right.
And that's really the important issue. And that's the issue I think we can have interesting conversations about. That can even be tough.
Yeah.
So what is it enough to be a human to have a moral status? As a Christian, it's pretty easy to say, well, all humans are created in the image of God. So when we connect the term human with image of God and put some sense of value in that, then we have our answer.
Yeah.
But going into a secular society, that's not equally obvious.
Right.
So that's where the really good conversation can be had. And I think it's worth having.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that's been going on in the conversation in the public sphere. And so there was you guys got to help me out with the lady's name, but we know Dr. Phil, of course, had the leader of the I believe it's called Live Action, or something like that. Like it's a pro-life organization that's really big online. They had the founder of that organization there, and Dr. Phil kept trying to say, well, the literature on abortion is not conclusive, or sorry, the literature on embryology is not conclusive on whether or not what's inside the woman at conception is a living human being. And she was just not having it. She was just not letting him get a sentence out at all. Go ahead, Cam.
Yeah, I'd have two things to say about that. The first is,
Whoa, real quick. Sorry,
yeah.
before you say those two things.
I'm on.
Yeah. So she was just not having it. She was just not going to let him get it out. She was like, nope, the literature is universal. And Dr. Phil was like, okay, well, here's the article I'm talking about. And when you read the article, when it was actually read by people who were digging into it, you find that the article does not deny that life begins at conception or that what's in the woman is a living human being. What the article draws a question mark over is the issue of personhood, whether or not what's in the woman is a person, or and that goes to the values issue that like Leif was bringing up with the image of God and things like that. Is this is this a person that we have a moral obligation to keep alive and care for? So that's what the debate is around. The scientists in that article seem to chalk it up to the philosophers. And it's a good thing I've got a couple philosophers here to say two. One of them wants to say two things about it right now. So go ahead, Cameron.
Three things now.
Okay.
So thing one, Leif was right to be conservative when he said all the embryology textbooks, they all agree. They, as far as I know, and I've seen surveys of the literature, they just do. So by and large, it's basically universal position. However, there are, it's true that we have political ideas that are finding their way into hard science education. So we need to be aware of that. So but the first thing is, yes, by and large, and since for as long as we care to know, embryology has said exactly what Leif said. This is a living human being. Hasn't said much about being, actually, but has said it's a living human. And then they define stages of development, which we are all among, which we're all a part of, right? So so the zygote stage and the embryonic stage on through adolescence and puberty and adulthood and so on until death is it's a spectrum, and you can draw fuzzy boxes around certain epochs of that development. And then Jacob, you brought up an important thing, which is, so if we're discussing what life, you said they kicked it up to the philosophers. That's the exact right thing to do. People have this impulse. It's an epistemological question, but have this impulse to ask the scientists all the questions. And there are some questions that the scientists don't have the tools to answer, which like asking a chef to build a deck at your house. It's like some of their tools have some overlap, but he's not necessarily equipped to be the one to do that job. And so when we ask questions about life, is it life and is it human? Those actually can't really be defined well by the scientists. Those get defined by the philosophers, and the scientists can give us really interesting information about particular instances that can help us to understand our metaphysics and our ethics. And then finally, I think the question hinges on these two things, and it's so disappointing that in general the conversation doesn't go to these two places. Question one is, what are the kinds of things morally that it's that's morally allowable to kill? So what are the living things that it's morally permissible to take the life of? That's question one. And the second one is are these living human beings instances of that or not?
Sure.
And we hang out on the second question for the most part. But then the problem is, and Leif, I'm sure you know this, and I'd love to hear more about what you think. But what happens is the people who are in favor of abortion access tend to define. I'm just going to call it. I'll call it the embryo. I don't mean to use a loaded term, but we got to call it something. Tend to define that living human being in such a way that it's morally permissible to kill it. But then we can think of intuitively very clear examples of living human beings that have been born that meet those same criteria that we're sure you're not allowed to take the life of. And so we're looking for what's the morally relevant distinction. And in most of the cases, when we try to find something accidental about this living human being, such that we're morally permitted to take its life, that applies to born living human beings also. And so we end up then having to talk about essential characteristics of living human beings, and there's just there's no obvious point when a human gets those, say after it's conceived, something like that. So I think those are all the things I want to say just now. Is good, give it to the philosophers when it comes to what's the definition of life, and because scientists don't know. Although if they have a good definition of life, they can tell us whether or not something is alive. Thank you, scientists. I'm so glad for what you do. But then what are those morally relevant distinctions? And in most cases, somebody will offer a morally relevant distinction such that they morally justify abortion. But then we could see how that distinction ends up not being actually a morally relevant distinction, because you can't apply it to a born human and then be morally permitted to kill them also. What do you think?
So I think that the most interesting conversations is exactly in this area. Like, what are the qualities that, if it's not just in being a human, like one would say, for instance, as a Christian, one could ask, well, what else is there? What is it that defines moral value? And I think at least in Norway, there's still a very very deep instinct that all humans matter equally. And that was the case also for me. I knew that was one of my pure tenets. I believe this is true. I did also know that when I say true, I mean true for me. So I was aware that is troublesome to just generalize that and say everyone needs to adhere to this standard. But thankfully, it's also the case that I would say most Norwegians are there. So it's still a good way to like pop the bubble. Like, okay, if you suggest this quality, for instance, consciousness, okay, can we then kill an unconscious human? No, they would not like that. Okay,
right.
So at least we speak with someone who still have the instinct that this is not correct. But I would not presume that would or will be the case in 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
I don't think that will be as obvious at all.
So I wonder, I have another question. Do you mind if I interject, Jacob?
Go for it.
I have one other question. I wonder how you answer. Someone will insist that the living human being that we're talking about actually qualifies as a parasite, which being in the category parasite means that that it doesn't have the right to live, and that it's morally permissible, therefore, to rid yourself of a parasite. How would you respond to that?
So I would start like, first we need to see what we're meaning by the terms, because a parasite is normally not the same species as it is parasitic to. And that we have already started calling it a human. So if it is true that it is a human, we would in that case have the only instance of a parasite being parasitic to itself. So it, at the very least, just calling it a parasite does not seem to overlap with what we normally call a parasite.
Yeah.
Right.
And then I would say that so that's the first like intuition. What do we mean by these words? But I would also say that when we look at a fetus, that is in no way similar to a parasite. The closest you get to that it could be a parasite is it depends on nutrition from its host. But that in no way seems to get to a parasite.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's
Exactly.
lots of things require nutrition from their hosts.
Yeah.
So that's not a parasite at all.
Yeah. Or you can just go on the line of reasoning Cameron did earlier, where we can find examples of, like a 2-year-old. It depends on nutrition from the host. Babies in infancy who breastfeed are dependent on their host for nutrition. But I mean, the whole comparison to a parasite thing it seems so. The human beings, it's of their nature, or it's a part of their nature. It's how their bodies are made to conceive and bear children. So it is not having a parasite of a different species on your body. That's not part of your nature to have that. That's something wrong that's inserted itself
a
into the picture.
reproductive relationship is qualitatively different than a parasitic one. And
Absolutely.
As I'm thinking now, I think the rhetorical force of calling it a parasite, I haven't thought much about this before, but as I'm thinking about it now, the rhetorical force of calling it a parasite is you import some moral intuitions by calling it parasite, which is parasites are bad. So I wonder, so the idea that if it's a parasite, then it doesn't have a right to life. Well, where does that come from? What part of the definition of parasite means that this thing doesn't have a right to live, especially on a materialistic and naturalistic worldview. Parasites and hosts, that's not a better or worse relationship than, it's just a different one. And so I don't think you can help yourself to the moral permission of being allowed to kill a thing because you can define it as parasite. That's to import, I think, some morally intuitive baggage that that isn't justified just by the definition.
Right. Parasites, by their definition, need to be removed. So there's loading of moral intuitions. There's some question begging, it seems, going on there. And so, yeah, I agree with my philosopher guests. I don't think it's apt at all to first of all to call it a parasite, and even if you wanted to call it a parasite in the sense that it depends on the host, we already just got into an example of how an infant still depends on the host, and we know that we can't kill infants. We know that that's morally wrong.
Yeah, but it's also not clear why calling it a parasite means you're allowed to kill it. Just because you call it that thing, right? There's such a thing as a parasitic relationship biologically. We have symbiotic relationships, and we have parasitic relationships. And you could imagine, maybe not by definition, but you could imagine a naturalistic world where the parasites take over, where you have all parasites and no hosts or something. And that's just a different course of events than you have hosts and no parasites. So I think we think of parasites, we go, ooh, that's bad because it is detrimental to the life of the host. But but that still is amoral. Otherwise, extinction is an immoral thing to have, or something like that. You have to justify why death as such is immoral, or why the death of the host is immoral, but the death of the parasite is not. And I think that's really hard to justify and ground on a materialistic worldview. I don't think they have the tools to do that. I think you're helping yourself to a bit of rhetoric and intuition that the definition doesn't justify.
Good. Let's move on to something still similar to this track, but kind of one of the talking points that gets brought up in this conversation a lot. So we've already kind of talked about, what is the nature of what is inside the woman's body? What is it? And then we had talked about the parasite conversation. And Leif, I'll pass this to you first. What about when someone says, you know what? This is the woman's body. And she has the bodily autonomy to decide what happens to her body. And so because of that, she is allowed to get an abortion because it's her body. How would you respond to that talking point / argument?
So I think first off, I like to meet someone in their line of questioning. So I would say bodily autonomy is very important. It is something I at least in Norway we really raise bodily autonomy to the point that no, that's a completely different subject. So, but at least to a very high, to a very high degree, at least. So I would agree that bodily autonomy is a good thing. But the question is still, as we have already alluded to, that if this is a human living being, we need to ask us, is bodily autonomy a good reason to end this human living being? That is the important question. How valuable is bodily autonomy versus that being becoming whatever it is becoming?
Yeah.
And I do think that the strongest case for abortion is exactly trying to weigh this out. Where you have people saying, yes, it's a human, yes, it's even a person, yes, it has moral worth, but that autonomy is a higher value than this primitive life. So I do think that if you're going to be the most consistent kind of pro-choice, that is the best potential to do it. And we do see people actually bringing this position forth, but they often have a problem then with where to put that specific line. And that is the real tough decision here. Where does that those slides meet each other? And we could, of course, just say, well, it's at 12 weeks because we have decided so.
Yeah.
But then we changed our laws now to 18 weeks. And then we change our laws to 5 weeks. Okay. So it's just about who decides what. And that at least does not seem like a good sort of standard.
Yeah. Well, I think we have intuitions about essential values that are coming into conflict, and that's something that we run into in our moral lives all the time. We have competing moral values, and one of them has to take precedence. But it's interesting how you describe it. The way I hear it is, well, humans essentially, because of what they are, have a right to bodily autonomy. If anyone owns my body, it's me, and it's definitely not you.
Yeah.
But then also, essentially, because of what we are, we have a right not to be killed. So now we have this case where now those two things are in conflict with one another. So the living human being is essentially imbued or has, based on its essence, a right to not be killed, but the woman in whom it's growing essentially has ownership over her own body, and then what we try and do is then figure out their accidental qualities and see who wins, which I think is a losing battle. So that's when we start assigning time frames. Okay, well, yeah, it has an essential right to life, but it's not fully actualized until there's a heartbeat, or there's brain chemistry, or there's consciousness, or there's whatever, and then we run into the same problem. I think every time I consider what are these things that a living human being does such that it acquires a right not to be killed at that moment, generally they apply to instances where intuitions tell us clearly, no, you can't kill that thing.
Well, speaking of intuitions, for a second, I mean, for me, like, the way that I intuit this is very, very, very far from clear that the line of when bodily autonomy outweighs the moral obligation not to kill the thing, and then the scales tip from going to 11 to 12 weeks, or 12 to 18 weeks, or after 18 weeks these scales tip again. That is very far from clear for me. So if it's a living human thing from conception, you get to 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, 20 weeks to birth. Its nature never changes from conception to birth to death. And yet the line between, but bodily autonomy is more important and outweighs the obligation not to kill the baby at 8 weeks, or 1 week to 12 weeks, or now to 18 weeks. And then it becomes less important, or less outweighs the other obligation after 24 weeks. That is just stating that. Like, I understand the sentence. And we had a long conversation before we started filming about what understanding a sentence means. So I understand what the words are, but the truth of it is very far from clear. I do not see any reason to believe that at all, as it stands.
Well, and there's a famous thought experiment about the moral permissibility of abortion, and I'm going to I'm going to shorten it slightly, but it's something like, you wake up and there's another person's body connected to your body so that they can borrow your kidneys. And it's temporary. It's only for 9 months. This person is going to be connected to your body. If you disconnect them, they die. And if you keep them connected, after 9 months, they live and they can be disconnected forever. And then the intuition that's getting, that's touching, is, okay, so do you have a moral obligation to keep this person hooked up to you? You didn't ask for it. It happened while you were unaware. now that this person's been hooked up, if you disconnect them, they die. But do you really have a moral responsibility to to keep this person alive by keeping them hooked up to your body?
Mm.
And there's been a debate about that for 50 odd years. And it usually centers around the person being connected to you, whether you knew about it, if that's analogous to becoming pregnant, it's not a natural process, whatever. And that's usually where it hinges. But I heard Jonathan Pritchett, he just kind of ignored all of that. He goes, you know what? Maybe you do have an obligation. Like, why are we so fast just to say,
Yeah.
like, no, that person got hooked up to you and you have no responsibility to keep them alive because you didn't ask for it and it's not you. Maybe why don't we take life more seriously than that? That if that was such a situation and someone got hooked up to you like that, then like why is it not obvious to us? Yes, you do have a responsibility to keep that person hooked up until they can their kidneys function on their own.
Yeah.
So that's my intuition in that example. I have always struggled with why so few are entertaining that that moral obligation. I would think you might. I'm not saying it's absolutely sure that you are
Right.
obligated, but at the very least, it's not obvious to me that you're not obligated to. To me, it seems like you might actually be in such a case that you might be obligated to stay connected.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I just want to say, so when I think about that example, I'm not similar to what you said a second ago, Life, where you said like you're not totally sure if you have that obligation, but you might. I'm very similar in those thoughts. So I don't know that you do, but you could. And I also think that that's a good, whether or not I think that that's the right answer in the situation, I think that's a good rejoinder to the argument where it's like, well, hang on a second. What are our moral intuitions, or what are our first, like our impulsive reactions to, how we approach life, how we value life? And I mean, that's the question.
Well, I think there's an interesting conflict. It's not an outright contradiction, but there's an interesting conflict between that intuition that says, no, you don't need to keep the person hooked up, you owe them nothing, and Norway's generous welfare state that says that we should be caring for those without privilege and those without power, and that you have a moral duty to do so. So in Norway, we pay very high taxes, and we take for granted that people should be taken care of when they lack the ability to care for themselves, something like that. I'm trying not to be too precise, but there's also that instinct. You said, Leif, earlier that like we have this intuition in Norway that human beings are all equally valuable. And so we don't let them go poor, and we don't let them go hungry, and we don't let them freeze outside because they have essential value somehow. But then maybe that's why you as a Norwegian weren't so quick to have the intuition, disconnect them from me. I don't know that person anything. I woke up and they're hooked up to me. But anyways, if somebody had the intuition, know that you don't owe them anything, that you didn't ask to be hooked up to my kidney, I own my body, not you, there at least seems to be some friction between that instinct and the instinct in Norway that says, no, we're going to have a very generous welfare state, even though it costs the typical Norwegian a lot of various resources in order to accomplish that.
And I would also like to draw the parallel here between this kind of not knowing and the kind of not knowing I started with, because they seem to me to be pretty much parallel. If I'm not sure if I am morally obligated to keep on giving life to this person or not, I better become really sure before I unconnect. So to me, the instinct here would be to not disconnect unless I was completely sure that it was absolutely morally permissible.
Yeah. That's actually what I was thinking as you talked about it, that we could draw parallels to the first thing we've talked about. We're going a little long, but and so this last thing I want to talk about is the last thing that we should address in this video. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about this, and it's not exactly fair to either Cameron or Leif because this isn't in the outline. So it's going to be some.
All right.
It's going to be something new.
But it's going to go long. You just have to expect.
Yeah, that's okay. So we are Christians, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't spend some time talking about how where this issue in people's lives that causes a lot of hurt, that causes a lot of moral conflict between people in society, and that causes heated debate and division, but most importantly, deep personal hurt in people's lives. Who young people get pregnant unplanned, people who've had abortions and face deep regret over it. How can the gospel of Jesus intersect with this issue? And I just want to open that up to either Leif or Cameron. How can the gospel of Jesus Christ intersect with this issue?
So, we have an hour more. Was that it? Yeah.
Not today, but yeah.
Well, I do think that in terms that the gospel is good news, this is one of the places it seems to me easy to claim that it is good news. First, if you're struggling with something that has happened, the Christian message is that no matter what, there is forgiveness waiting for you. If that's something you deeply struggle with, redemption and healing can be found in Jesus. So that's both on a psychological level, a theological level, and on a just living day-to-day level. These are profoundly good news. That's a good start, at least.
Absolutely. Cameron, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think much more than that. I think that that's like taking the first jump into 1,000-foot deep well of the goodness and the riches of God. But that's it. I think we treat this issue in church as a way of kind of keeping people outside of the inner group. It's how we maybe define our circle of Christians. And maybe we don't say, if you are in favor of abortion, then you can't be part of our group. But we definitely imply that, at least in the United States. That's how we distinguish ourselves from them or something like that. And I think too infrequently, we present the gospel as the solution, both eternally and in terms of the person either who is guilty of abortion or doesn't think the same way about it as we do, as though the gospel's not big enough to like, there are some sins the gospel doesn't cover or something like that. And if what we're doing as Christians is telling the world that there are sins that they are guilty of that are too big, or like, well, man, you're gonna have to say a lot of prayers before Jesus gets over that one. It's like, man, God's already over. He already did that. That work is already accomplished. The forgiveness has already happened. Now what God wants us to do is come home. So if we take the parable out of Jesus' mouth of the prodigal son who wandered so far away from his father that he was doing the worst things. Right? He was lusting over pig food. He's wandered as far away from his father as he can. But when he comes to his senses, returns home in humility, and his father welcomes him because now he was dead and now is alive, and my son is home. Remembering that our Heavenly Father has that attitude with us, that no matter how far we wander, it's not like you've gone too far, or even like you have a longer road to walk back than someone whose sin life is maybe not as scandalizing. It's like Jesus says that if we are guilty of violating the law in one part, we violated the whole thing. So that's true. Some people's lives are greater or lesser. There are greater and lesser degrees of sinfulness and whatever, but there's not like greater degrees of distance from God before you can return to Him in faith and receive His forgiveness and be welcomed into His family. Like, so if we start making people think like, well, man, you're real bad, so you've got a real long walk. For me, it was easy. I just had to turn around and say, oh, shoot, sorry, I'm back, right? But for you, it's going to be a while. Then shame on us.
Right.
God's forgiveness has already covered all of that, and we're being invited at every moment to return home to God's family, where He receives us with joy. Where the scriptures say that when one lost sheep returns to the fold, that the angels in heaven rejoice. Like, we need to treat the world like that. When lost people return to God's family, what they're designed to be a part of, that the heavens rejoice when that happens. And yeah, I'm going to stop preaching. That's probably that's now we've gone this much. I don't know if we've gone any deeper, Life. I don't mean, but that's a very, very deep well of goodness to try and survey.
Yeah. But I think that's so, I mean, yes and amen to everything. I mean, you guys both said, and I mean, we deal with, or we help people on an individual basis, as they come into our churches and into our groups and things like that. And so the gospel might intersect specifically different in different situations, but the general and universal good news is that abortion, or considering abortion or going through with abortion, is certainly not unforgivable by God. Definitely not. The blood of Jesus, the grace that God offers through His sacrifice on the cross and His resurrection, is more than enough to wash clean, to purify, to cover over, to forgive any sin, including the sin of abortion. And so I think that is, the importance of that can't be overstated, because I think that, wanted to echo something that Cam touched on earlier, that what we definitely shouldn't do, what we can't do, is add any more shame onto the pile of shame they're probably already feeling. I would say like 10 times out of 10, there's some shame there, whatever stage you're at, either considering or going through with it. And what the church should do, what our response needs to be, is open arms, is love, is acceptance, is comfort, is the gospel. They need to know that they're not second-tier believers or second-tier members or anything like that. No, if you repent and put your faith in Jesus, even repent of the sin of abortion, you are graciously loved, cherished wonderfully, received with open arms, and receive full status as a child of God. And I think the importance of that can't be overstated. Thank you guys for commenting on that last little detour at the end there. I really appreciate it. Leif, thank you so much for coming on the podcast for these last 2 episodes. We really appreciated it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, we'll have to do this. We'll have to talk about more stuff.
Yes, obviously.
We have a real live apologist on the hook.
That's right. We'll definitely make sure that we make that happen. Once again, Leif, thank you so much. And for you at home listening to this, I hope you really appreciated this conversation. I mean, we tried to touch on these things sensitively. We know that they're really serious issues. I hope we were able to give you some food for thought, and maybe hopefully give you, it would be through God's divine providence through us, but give you some wisdom in how to approach this issue in your current context, whether that's in Norway or in America or wherever. And so thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Word First Radio. Be sure to like, subscribe, and check us out online at wordfirst.us. Yeah!